The Apostle Paul's statement about not permitting women to teach or have authority over men is found in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 11 to 12. A woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet. This passage has been the subject of much debate and discussion throughout church history. To understand why Paul made this statement, we need to consider several factors, including the cultural context, theological context, and interpretation of the passage. Cultural and historical context. In the Greco-Roman and Jewish culture of Paul's time, women typically did not hold positions of authority in public religious or educational settings. The roles of women were largely domestic, and public leadership was generally reserved for men. This was the social norm, and Paul's instructions may have been reflective of this broader cultural context. Additionally, in Ephesus, where Timothy was ministering, the Temple of Artemis was a significant religious center where female priestesses had influence. Paul may have been addressing specific concerns related to these practices, where false teachings or pagan influences were seeping into the church. Concern for order in worship. In 1 Timothy chapter 2, Paul is providing instructions for orderly worship in the church. He addresses both men and women, and his emphasis in this passage is on appropriate behavior in public worship. Paul's instruction for women to learn in quietness and not to teach may have been aimed at maintaining order in worship services and preventing disruptions. In the early Christian communities, it was critical to have orderly gatherings, especially as the church grew and welcomed people from diverse backgrounds. Theological context is crucial here. Paul provides some theological reasoning for his instruction in the following verses, where he refers to the creation order and the fall of Adam and Eve. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not the one deceived. It was the woman who was deceived and became a sinner. Paul seems to be grounding his argument in the creation narrative from Genesis. Some interpret this as Paul viewing the fall as a cautionary tale, indicating that men should lead to avoid similar deception. Others see this as reflecting Paul's belief in complementarian roles, where men and women have distinct but complementary roles in the church and the family. Complementarian view. Some Christian traditions interpret this passage as teaching that women should not hold positions of teaching authority over men in the church, particularly as pastors or elders. This view holds that men and women have different complementary roles in church leadership, with men being called to leadership and teaching roles. Egalitarian view. Others argue that Paul's instructions were specific to the cultural and situational context of the church in Ephesus, and are not meant to apply universally for all times. This view emphasizes that Paul affirmed women in other leadership roles, such as Priscilla, who taught Apollos, and Phoebe, a deacon. In this interpretation, Paul's prohibition is seen as addressing specific issues in that church rather than establishing a blanket rule for all churches. It's important to note that Paul also affirmed women in various roles of ministry elsewhere in his letters. Priscilla was involved in teaching alongside her husband Aquila. Phoebe is referred to as a deacon and a benefactor. Junia is mentioned as outstanding among the apostles. Paul also referred to women such as Euodia and Syntyche as his co-laborers in the gospel. These examples suggest that Paul's restrictions on women teaching in 1 Timothy the 2nd of May have been specific to the context of that church and not intended as a universal ban on women in leadership or teaching roles. Paul's statement in 1 Timothy 2:12 about not permitting women to preach or exercise authority over men is understood differently across Christian traditions. It is often interpreted in light of the cultural, social, and theological context of his time, and the question of whether it applies universally remains debated. Some view this as part of Paul's concern for orderly worship and gender roles in the church, while others argue that it was a situational instruction, not meant to limit women's roles in church leadership permanently. Paul's affirmation of women in ministry elsewhere indicates that he saw them as important contributors to the mission of the early